Hello, I'm Casey Cancer. This is week two reflection discussion question regarding the potential for the reduce of recidivism within our community corrections as well as prison. Also, it's going to cover does it work for some offenders and not so well for others? And finally, what approaches work and do not work, um, in my opinion. Well, first off, there's always going to be a potential for the reducing of recidivism, and the problem is that we found over time is we have to see whether or not certain inmates are going to respond well to certain type of treatment, and if some inmates do not respond well to certain types of treatment. Um, we just have to find the best method of reducing the recidivism rate throughout prisons. Um, Firstly, we're going to talk about, a lot of a lot of the readings do talk about community corrections, whether that be probation and parole. And a lot of people in America have a brick wall regarding corrections, and whenever they hear corrections, they only think of prison, but they're actually mostly wrong because corrections is largely probation and parole. And in our country, as the article stated, there's 5 million people on probation and parole. So if we actually wanted to decrease recidivism, then we need to focus on the larger majority of the country and what those offenders need rather than what the small majority of offenders need. Um, a lot of the articles argue that you decrease the use of confinement in prisons for nonviolent offenders, and you can increase the training and the pay and the budget for probation and parole. And whenever you get somebody that is responding well to a job that they feel respected in, such as a probation and parole officer, and if they got paid more and it'd be a higher demanded job, then probation and parole could end up being overall better for inmates and offenders as well as the probation and parole officer themselves. Um, does it work for some and not for others? Of course. For some offenders, you're going to have to incapacitate them. You're going to have to keep them away from community for a certain amount of time to have them reflect on their own personal needs. And some inmates that go to prison on drug offenses, you don't really need to incapacitate them as much. The problem is how much money are you willing to spend on separating these types of offenders and trying to actually classify them under that sort of approach. A lot of the article that I really liked that we read, it talked about justice model liberal, and basically that the justice model liberals basically believe that the current system's attempt to help the offender actually hurts them in the end. And we can see this with the Get Tough on Crime movement that struck in the 80s and the 90s. After the rehabilitative movement ended kind of in the 70s, we saw a Get Tough on Crime movement, and that in the increase of confinement for punishment rather than trying to help them with probation and parole. Um, and I liked how the justice model liberals kind of brought up indeterminate sentencing, whether, at first we thought it was a good thing. You don't have a blanket statement of how long you're going to be in, and you could be in for a certain amount of time depending on, whether or not you're good in prison, and whether or not the parole board actually releases you. But then what we found out was that parole boards weren't releasing people on time, so it actually increased the confinement area that they actually had to do. Also,